Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Miller, JDC board member and chairman of the JDC Archives Committee. I am delighted to welcome you to the JDC Archives' third annual Helen Cohen Memorial Lecture, endowed by Jerry and Linda Spitzer in memory of Jerry's beloved aunt. I want to warmly welcome and thank our co-sponsor, the Jewish Book Council. The JDC Archives, which houses the records of JDC since its creation 106 years ago, is one of the most important repositories of the world for modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and others. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in the JDC archives. Our co-sponsor, the Jewish Book Council, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating and enriching the community through Jewish literature, strengthening connections to the Jewish life and identity, and inspiring conversations between generations of readers. Our speaker today is Dr. Avi Patt. He is the director of the chair of Jewish Studies and the director of the Center for Jewish Studies of Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. He is the author of many, many books on the Holocaust, and one in particular, The JDC at 100, A Century of Humanitarianism, which was co-edited by our own Linda Levy. Dr. Patt will speak today about his new book on the early post-war memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, the Afterlife of the Revolt, published by Wayne State University Press, which will be issued in May. And just for a heads up, in our chat, we will give you a link to the Wayne State University. There's a deep discount, so you can order the book there. And tomorrow you will receive also information about how you can order Dr. Patt's book. This is particularly appropriate topic on Yom HaShoah, which marks the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. JDC Warsaw played major role in providing assistance in wartime Poland and in the Warsaw Ghetto. It supported health, welfare, and cultural and educational activities in the ghetto and helped finance the underground schools and youth movement. Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum, a department head of JDC Warsaw, headed the underground Oneg Shabbat archival group, which secretly recorded everyday life in the ghetto, providing an eyewitness account of German Nazi atrocities. Our format is that our speaker will talk today for about 45 minutes. We will then entertain questions. Please note that your microphones are turned off, and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send your questions at any time during the lecture. I am delighted now to welcome Avi Patt. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Debbie, for that kind introduction. And I want to thank the JDC Archives and the Jewish Book Council for sponsoring today's program and inviting me to speak as part of this year's Helen Cohen Memorial Lecture. And a special thank you to the Spitzer family for making this possible. It's an honor for me to be able to speak today in conjunction with the publication of my new book, which will be coming out very soon. And is actually available for order now. I want to say thank you as well for taking advantage of this opportunity that we have to all gather together here on Yom HaShoah to mark the date of Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, Holocaust Remembrance Day and Remembrance and Heroism Day. And also to do this through our new technological means that we've all developed over the course of the pandemic. It's especially nice for me to be able to deliver this talk today and to know that there are participants from around the globe, many friends and family and colleagues in the United States and Europe, Israel, and beyond. So thank you all for being here today. I'm going to share my presentation. I'm going to have a lot of materials to share with you, and I look forward to discussing this further and hearing questions that you may have when we get to the Q&A and discussion. As many of you likely know, in 2021, we will mark the 78th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which broke out on April 19th, 1943, the first night of Passover, when the Jewish Fighting Organization in Warsaw engaged in guerrilla warfare against the combined power of the German army, Ukrainian auxiliaries, and the SS. The Jewish Fighting Organization, funded to a great extent by funds collected by David Guzik and the JDC in Warsaw, as we just heard mentioned by Debbie, surprised the enemy before SS General Jürgen Stroop eventually switched to burning down the entire ghetto, one building at a time, finally crushing the revolt. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as the first mass revolt in a major city in Nazi-occupied Europe, became a symbol of Jewish resistance to Nazi oppression, inspiring similar revolts in Białystok and Minsk, as well as uprisings in Treblinka and Sobibor later in 1943. The Jewish fighters in Warsaw, under-equipped and overmatched, with few weapons and almost no military training, isolated and surrounded by an indifferent and at times hostile population, malnourished and diseased, managed to hold off the German forces for as long as the entire Polish army had in the invasion of Poland at the beginning of the war. But it was not enough. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would become the focal point of Holocaust memory in the aftermath of the Shoah in both Israel and America, with the date of April 19th used to mark Holocaust commemorations annually for years after the war. On the 5th anniversary of the revolt, the famous Rapoport monument was dedicated in Warsaw. And in 1951, Israel's Knesset designated the 27th of Nisan, 13 days after the uprising began, not conflicting with Passover, as the official date of Holocaust remembrance, Yom HaShoah VeHagvura. On April 19, 1951, a statue of Mordechai Anielewicz was unveiled at Kibbutz Yad Mordechai, the Negev kibbutz bearing his name, and a commemorative stamp bearing his image was released. In 1953, the Knesset passed the Yad Vashem law on the 10th anniversary of the revolt. It might seem obvious that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would become, in the words of historian Hasia Diner, quote, the prism through which Jews around the world understood and interpreted the murder of European Jewry during the Holocaust, or would be perceived, in the words of Israel Gutman, as, quote, a revolution in Jewish history. But how and why did this happen? Why would April 19th become the date of collective remembrance instead of, for example, let's say November 9th, Kristallnacht, September 1st, the date of the outbreak of the Second World War, September 29th and 30th, the dates of the massacre at Babi Yar, July 22nd, the dates of the great deportations to Treblinka from the Warsaw Ghetto, June 6th, D-Day, for example, or what has more recently become a prominent date on the international calendar, January 27th, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day for the liberation of Auschwitz. It is not self-evident that one date should be chosen over another. But the answer to this question tells us a lot about how a society chooses to use its history, to use its past in the service of the present and the future, the process by which collective memory continuously negotiates between available historical records and current social and political agendas. What my research on this topic has found is that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because of the timing of the outbreak, the unprecedented coverage that it received, and the dedicated work of surviving ghetto fighters to tell their story, became the focus of widespread attention in America and in the Yishuv in Palestine immediately after it occurred, and that it did little as an event to revolutionize the ways in which Jews perceive their position in the world, but instead seemed to confirm existing worldviews and was interpreted accordingly, but differently by different groups of Jews. Furthermore, it would take more than a year for some members of the Zionist movement to seize upon the event in purely Zionist terms as a part of the struggle for the creation of the Jewish state, and then not until the aftermath of the war that the uprising would be linked by survivors with the struggle to create the Jewish state. For the first year after the uprising, the most celebrated hero of the revolt was not Mordechai Anielewicz, but instead was the Bundist activist Michal Klepfish, as the revolt came to symbolize the Jewish contribution to the Allied war effort in freedom's struggle against fascism and totalitarianism. So let's examine why this happened. How did the context of April 1943 shape Jewish public reception of the news? Jews in the free world entered 1943 with the news that European Jewry was in the process of, quote, complete annihilation throughout occupied Europe, and yet felt largely powerless to stop it. Both screaming headlines and memorial pageants like We Will Never Die marked the transition from calls for rescue to calls for commemoration. Before the outbreak of fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto on April 19, 1943, however, the other major news item that captured the attention of the world Jewish press was the ill-fated Bermuda Conference, convened in response to urgent demands to rescue what was left of European Jewry. As the Jewish Frontier noted in an editorial in May of 1943, titled The Gentleman at Bermuda, quote, Hitler has won another victory at Bermuda, a moral political victory in which Nazism rejoices. The so-called refugee conference has made a mockery, not only of the agony of millions of helpless human beings, but of the great cause of liberation to which the democratic world is committed, and which alone makes the horror of our time understandable and endurable. The revolt was set against a context of complete despair, not only on the part of Warsaw Jewry alone and abandoned, with the knowledge that the final liquidation was inevitable, but also on the part of world Jewry, increasingly aware that the Jews had been abandoned and must resort to taking matters into their own hands. So when news did begin to spread throughout the world of the remarkable, unexpected, and surprising turn of events, the actual coverage was varied, and it ranged in tone from restrained to exuberant. Depending on the types of coverage, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which during the war had faced growing difficulties during the war, both reporting the news and then having its stories picked up. This report you can see here is what was published by the JTA. The general press, like the New York Times and other mainstream news sources, which consistently underreported Jewish atrocities, and the Jewish press, which was segmented according to political ideologies. On April 23, 1943, that is 4 days after the outbreak of the revolt, the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, delivered the first news of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, relaying a report received in Stockholm the day before with the headline, quote, Nazis start mass execution of Warsaw Jews on Passover, victims broadcast SOS. For the Vorwärts, for example, on the other hand, the Holocaust was the main story and attracted a great deal of attention. The Vorwärts, the largest Yiddish daily newspaper in the world at the time, approximately 250,000 copies in circulation in New York, it made the uprising, the beginning of the uprising, its cover story on April 23rd, and reported, quote, Nazis slaughter last Jews of Warsaw. Secret radio reports the Nazis leading the last 35,000 Jews to the slaughter, zu Schchita. And the Vorwärts, like the JTA, the secret radio report was also cited, and the article also noted that the Nazi massacre began just as Jews around the world, quote, marked the festival of freedom, unquote. And then again on April 25th, 1943, the Vorwärts reported, quote, Jews are fighting with weapons against the Nazis. Those who are currently mounting the resistance are the healthiest and the most militant kämpferischste Jews who remain in Warsaw after the Nazis had carried out the great mass murder and deportation last fall. The weapons with which the Jews are fighting were provided by the Polish underground movement, which also sent trained commanders for this last battle. Now, that last piece was something that they assumed would later be proven to not be true. Initial reporting in the newspaper of the Israel Workers' Movement, Davar, edited by one of the leaders of labor Zionism, Beryl Katznelson, paralleled reports in Vorwärts, while also emphasizing the continued connection between underground Zionist activists in Poland and the movement in Geneva and the Yishuv. The headlines describe the fighting Jews of Warsaw as both the She'erit HaPleita, the surviving remnant of the Jewish diaspora, and as the rebels, the Mitmardim, fighting the Nazis. Like the forward Davar reporting, mistakenly assumed that trained officers from the Polish underground had been sent to the ghetto to help, quote, manage the defense there, unquote. While coverage in the Jewish press continued to highlight the report, along with news on the other fronts of the war effort. And here you can see coverage in the New York Times from later that week. Within 2 weeks, by May 10th, 1943, the forwards added a new trope in its coverage of Warsaw, reporting on the Jiddische Helden von Warschau, the Jewish heroes of Warsaw. Other newspapers in New York also began to pick up on this trope of heroism. Szmul Zygielbojm, who was the editor of Der Tag, noted his suspicions of what today we would term fake news, assuming the story had been concocted by the Nazis to justify the crushing final liquidation of the ghetto. As he wrote on May 12, 1943, how was it possible, quote, for unarmed people to stand up even for ever so short a time against the greatest military machine the world has ever seen? And yet he realized that this was true and must be reported. As the Jewish press began the search for the Jewish heroes of Warsaw, with reports indicating that fighting there was winding down, reporting on Warsaw and the Bermuda Conference shifted to a new focus, the death of the Bundist activist in London, Szmul Zygielbojm. And here you can see the headline in the foreword, Szmul Zygielbojm tot in London. Zygielbojm was a prominent Polish interwar Bundist, representative of the Jewish Labor Bund. After leaving Warsaw for New York, he became the Bund's representative in the Polish National Council in London, an advisory body to the Polish government in exile. Upon hearing news of the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto in the aftermath of the uprising in spring of 1943, Zygielbojm committed suicide in protest over the world's lack of attention to prevent the mass murder of the Jews. And this is the obituary that was printed in the New York Times. In contrast to the glowing tribute to Zygielbojm in the Yiddish and Jewish socialist press, coverage in the labor Zionist press of Zygielbojm's suicide was muted and even critical. A May 21st, 1943 eulogy written in Davar wrote disparagingly of Zygielbojm and was critical of his choice to commit suicide, Kiddush Hashem, much like the head of the Judenrat, Adam Chernyakov, who took his own life at the start of the Great Deportation. The forwards published an article on Saturday, May 29, 1943, offering further detail on who the actual leaders of the revolt had been, noting that, quote, 200 Jews led thousands of young people, older men, women, and children, radicals, Orthodox, and other groups in battle against the Nazis, noting that while, quote, it is impossible to discover the truth, it is clear that a great bloody battle has taken place. By the end of May 1943, further details on the dramatic fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto began to emerge. On May 24, 1943, JTA reported that Ignacy Schwartzbart had delivered secret reports to the British Parliament conveyed to him and Szmul Zygielbojm by the Jewish National Committee in Warsaw. And here you can see a telegram sent by Schwartzbart to the Jewish agency. These reports would include secret communiques drafted by Adolf Berman of the Jewish National Committee and Yitzchak Antek Zuckerman of the Jewish Fighting Organization from the Aryan side of Warsaw, detailing the first 10 days of the uprising and its bitter and desperate final days. These cables sent by Berman and Zuckerman would add further detail to the dramatic saga of the revolt and clarified that, quote, particularly stiff resistance was put up by several thousand Jews who barricaded themselves in underground storehouses of the ghetto. After 9 days of bombardment and siege, in the report, they noted an estimated 1,000 Nazis killed. In the Q&A, we can discuss these numbers and the complexities of determining how many actually died. The report added, quote, the heroic resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto continues with a few strongholds holding out. The report also began to fill in crucial details on the heroic fighting, identifying the existence of a, quote, Jewish fighting organization, which shows great ingenuity and courage, and offering a name, Klepfish, quote, an engineer, was one of the pillars of the determined resistance. He died like a hero. And indeed, Klepfish, who was a member of the Jewish Labor Bund and had training as a chemist, as a chemical engineer, designed the explosives that exploded under the feet of the Nazis as they marched into the ghetto on the second day of the revolt. At the same time, as news of deaths and names of heroes began to emerge, memorial services were organized. In the Yishuv, Tzivila Betkin and Tosia Altman were eulogized in June of 1943, after it was believed that they had both died in the uprising by Meir Ya'ari, leader of Hashomer Tzair. And Ya'ari spoke and said, quote, "These two women saved our dignity. They are legends." Later, it would become clear that Tzivia had survived, while Tosia had died 2 weeks after the end of the uprising in a fire in Warsaw. On June 3rd, 1943, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported that London's Evening Standard had proposed, and this you can see as a banner marking this commemoration of what they thought was the death of these two women. On June 3rd, 1943, JTA reported that London's Evening Standard had proposed making April 19th of every year a so-called Jewish Day. April 19th, the day when human valor converted the Warsaw Ghetto into a fortress of freedom, should be an honored day among men cherishing mercy and tolerance. Jews are fighting today on all fronts for the cause of humanity, and the Jew will be among the proud participants of common victory, unquote. 2 weeks later, on June 16th, 1943, the JTA reported on plans for a mass meeting in New York to commemorate the Jewish heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Jewish Labor Committee organized the Saturday evening, June 19th mass meeting at Carnegie Hall to celebrate the heroes and to honor Szmul Zygielbojm, featuring speakers such as the Polish ambassador, Dr. Stephen S. Wise, Adolf Held, and others. Lucy Schildkreuz, later to be known as Lucy Davidovich, recalled the June 19th, 1943 service in her memoirs. "We went and we wept, yet there was pride in what the Polish Jews had done. For the first time anywhere during the German occupation of Europe, a civilian population had taken up arms against the German oppressors. Not just any civilian population, but the most oppressed, the most helpless, the most desperate. In the next weeks, Bundist and Zionist underground reports from Warsaw reaching the West gave details of the fighting and listed the names of the dead and the few survivors. The events of the Warsaw Ghetto burned into my consciousness. The Warsaw Ghetto became a constant part of my internal life. I used to imagine myself there, test myself as to how I would have behaved. Would I have had the courage to fight? Would I have had the stamina against despair?" Writing in the labor Zionist publication, The Jewish Frontier, Marie Sirkin, later the author of Blessed is the Match, the first historical account of Jewish resistance written in English in 1947, Sirkin wrote in July of 1943 of a desire to know the identities of the heroes. "We do not know the names of the heroes," she wrote, "and we cannot pin medals on their breasts, even posthumously. But here and there a figure emerges. We all know the names of Adam Chernyakov and of Zygielbojm, who killed himself in London in protest against the indifference of the world. To these names, we can now add that of Tzivia Lebetkin, the mother. Tzivia, the mame, was not old, nor did she have children of her own. She lost her life at the age of 28 as a leader of the ghetto's final battle. Young as she was the mother, by virtue of strength and solicitude, of the crushed, the abandoned, the helpless." And you can see here in the picture, this is a picture actually of Tzivia Lebetkin delivering her famous testimony in June of 1946 when she finally reached the Yishuv and stood at Kibbutz Yagur for 8 hours telling her story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. What Sirkin did not know at the time, however, was that Lebetkin had in fact survived, as a group of approximately 40 surviving ghetto fighters managed to sneak out of the ghetto through the sewers on May 10th, 1943, with Simcha Rotem. Kajik, who you can see here on the left side of your screen, escaped after the Mila 18 command bunker had been gassed. Lebetkin and he led them through the sewers, and this is the site in Warsaw where you can see that they crawled out of the sewers, and there is a memorial to those who crawled out of the sewers that you can visit today. Lobetkin and Tosia Altman and Hirsch Berlinski, Israel Kanal, Tuvia Buzhikovsky, they were among the initial leaders of this group. Yitzhak Zuckerman, who was the deputy ZOB commander and had been on the Aryan side of Warsaw when the revolt broke out, would join them after their escape into the forest after a few days. In the weeks and months after the uprising, the surviving ghetto fighters and activists on the Jewish National Committee, aided by Adolf Berman and David Guzik of the JDC, engaged in a frenzy of activity to organize relief work, to rescue those Jews who could still be saved, and at the same time began to draft reports of the uprising, first writing reports in June of 1943 that would only reach London and then the rest of the free world in February of 1944. And here you can see this is one of the first reports written by the Jewish Fighting Organization, and a list of names of those who fell in the defense of the Warsaw Ghetto. You can see at the top of the list Mordechai Anielewicz and Tosia Altman, and many other names from all the different political parties and youth groups listed here. And here's Adolf Berman, who was representative of the Jewish National Committee, who would work together actually with Guzik and others and Zuckerman to draft these reports. In August of 1943, so now we're just talking about 4 months after the revolt, the World Jewish Congress published Lest We Forget, the massacre of the Warsaw Ghetto, to commemorate 1 year after the Great Deportation, which decimated the largest Jewish population center in Europe. While the report focused primarily on what was termed, quote, the massacre of the ghetto, and included very detailed information on the process of the roundups in Warsaw and on the physical layout of Treblinka, the report also concluded, however, with basic information on what was then known about the revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto, led by a small Jewish fighting organization with minimal arms who managed to hold off the Germans for 4 weeks in, quote, tragic struggle. As it wrote in the report, the ghosts of the heroes of the ghetto battle will forever honor the streets of Nalewki, Novolipki, Karmelitska, Mila, and others. But persistent reports in the press in spring and summer 1943 indicate that not only their spirit, but also their successors survive and carry on the fight there. The curtain may not have yet been rung down. Even without detailed reports of the underground in hand, we can see in real time the beginning of 2 simultaneous processes with the uprising: politicization and mythologization. Beyond newspaper coverage and rallies, over the course of 1943, news about the uprising began to be interpreted in broad public settings. At the same time, this process of mythologizing and fictionalizing the heroism of the uprising enabled diverse audiences to imagine themselves in the same situation as within 6 months of the revolt. In October of 1943, a few days before Yom Kippur, this radio play called The Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto was first broadcast on NBC radio as part of the Eternal Light series. Written by Morton Wishegrad, the play, which tells the story of the fictional Isaac Davidson, a fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto who lost his family in the Great Deportations. And the one you can see here is from a rebroadcast just 2 months later in honor of Hanukkah in December of 1943. In the radio play, Isaac explains that after the Great Deportation, quote, we no longer ask for rescue and for mercy, we ask for weapons. And there was silence. You did not answer. Isaac related how dynamite, rifles, and grenades were smuggled through the sewers with the assistance of Polish underground to Jews in the ghetto until April 19, 1943, when 35,000 Jewish men, women, and children stood ready to greet a detachment of stormtroopers in light tanks. After wiping out the entire detachment, Davidson recounted, the Jewish fighters battled SS troops as, quote, flags of the United Nations floated over the roofs of the ghetto. And we can discuss this further. There's a story on the second day of the revolt in Muranovsky Square at the northern part of the ghetto. Fighters associated with Beitar, with the revisionist Zionist organization, indeed put up two flags over the building at the northern part of the ghetto, a Zionist flag with a Magen David on it and a Polish national flag, two flags over the ghetto. The identities of these flags would subsequently be reinterpreted, and you can see here using a United Nations flag. We can talk about that process. Davidson, in the fictional Davidson, also talked about Jewish engineers in the ghetto exploding 8,000 factories producing material for Germany. The entire ghetto was in flames, but the Jews continued to fight after 37 days. A few Jews with guns fighting a Nazi army for 37 days, unquote. As Jeffrey Chandler notes, this historic broadcast was the first mainstream dramatic representation of the uprising 6 months after the battle, and just days before the high holidays. The response was so overwhelming that the program was aired again for Hanukkah in December of 1943. The play situated the heroic struggle within a religious framework, making use of ritual music, biblical language, and imagery. An unnamed voice likened the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto to, quote, the scapegoats of the centuries, and recalled Leviticus descriptions of the release of goats into the wilderness. Quote, but for them in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was no wilderness, only the abyss. In advance of Yom Kippur, the play made it clear who the new scapegoat offering this year would be. And here you can see the playwright Morton Wishegrad, photographs of Milton Krentz from the AJC, American Jewish Committee Radio Department. Now, while artists, writers, and composers sought to channel the symbolic power of the ghetto revolt to dramatize its significance for audiences, political leaders in the Yishuv in London and in New York quickly began to debate its political meaning, as the search for the heroes who had organized the revolt, along with the sources of their inspiration, took on added weight. Jewish leaders in New York, London, and the Yishuv played a key role in both interpreting the events for a broader Jewish audience, eager to learn the identities of, quote, the Jewish heroes of Warsaw, and shaping the collective memory of the event for a Jewish public, trying to imagine what it would have been like to take part in the ghetto revolt. By April 19th, 1944, as had been called for less than 2 months after the uprising, this date, April 19th, would become an anniversary to hold memorial services around the world. In advance of the anniversary, the United States State Department issued a message, quote, no finer page has been written in the long history of the Jews than the battle waged by unarmed men, women, and children against the brutal Nazi murderers. The heroic defenders of the Warsaw Ghetto have strengthened the spirit of free peoples resolved upon the extinction of Nazi tyranny and the liberation of all oppressed people. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported in advance of the anniversary that, quote, the first anniversary of the heroic resistance of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, which the Germans were not able to suppress for more than a month, will be commemorated tomorrow by Jews throughout the United States, with memorial meetings, a 15-minute work stoppage, and the issuance of a proclamation by the American Jewish Conference to the democratic world, pleading for the rescue of the Jews who can still be saved. Likewise, as you can see here, the Synagogue Council of America proclaimed April 19, 1944, to be a day of prayer and sorrow, calling all rabbis to, quote, convoke special services on April 19th to honor and mourn the heroes and martyrs of the ghettos who sacrificed their lives in the cause of the United Nations and for the glory of Israel, and to dedicate themselves to the effort of rescuing the survivors. On April 19th, 1944, over 30,000 Jews gathered in New York City before the steps of City Hall to hear speeches by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and prominent Jewish leaders. Judge Joseph M. Proskauer, president of the American Jewish Committee, issued a statement emphasizing that in all the heroism of the worldwide war, no single act compares with the valor of the starving, downtrodden Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. April 19th, 1943 is a date that will long be remembered in Jewish annals. 35,000 Warsaw Jews, the remnant of the greatest Jewish community in continental Europe, entered into a suicide pact. Though resistance was futile, though it spelled inevitable death, these heroic Jews chose to die fighting. They chose to sacrifice their lives upon the altar of the battle against totalitarianism. As reported in the Forwards, hundreds of thousands of Jews in New York honored the Jewish heroes and martyrs of Poland with sorrowful demonstrations, marches to City Hall with the participation of the mayor. The New York Times, in an editorial devoted to the first anniversary of the revolt, termed the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto as, quote, an example of courage that history can scarcely match, noting all faiths and creeds thrill at the heroic story. Among those pictured behind Mayor LaGuardia and Rabbi Rosenstein on the steps of City Hall in New York were the poet, the Polish Jewish poet Julian Tuwim, and the artist Arthur Szyk. Tuwim, the exiled Polish Jewish poet, wrote the poem or manifesto, We Polish Jews in New York, in April of 1944. Anticipating the monument that would be created by Natan Rapoport in Warsaw, Tuwim called for, quote, a new monument to be added to the national shrine that would honor the heroes of the Jewish people alongside their martyrs in We Polish Jews. The Polish Jewish artist, Arthur Szyk, who you can also see standing back in the background behind the rabbi, who had arrived in New York in 1940 and almost single-handedly led an artistic effort to convince the American public to support the war effort, created the repulsed attack to commemorate the first anniversary of the revolt. The image appeared in numerous publications. The cover page of Our Journal in English noted the volume was published to remember the heroic struggle of our brothers in Warsaw, a city that no longer has any Jews. And indeed, Szyk's illustration depicted, as we can see here, only male Jewish fighters triumphant over the fallen SS, wearing the Star of David as a mark of pride, not a badge of shame. While Szyk did not depict any female fighters, and it's cut off here at the bottom, but there are dead Germans and SS officers at the bottom of the image. But Szyk did not depict any female fighters. By then, the names of Tosia Altman, Sivi Lebedkin, Topsha Davidovich, and others had been reported in various places. He did represent the revolt as a popular uprising, reflecting a cross-section of the Jewish population, young and old, religious and secular, middle class and working class among the Jewish fighters. And while Jews in New York and London marked the first anniversary with large-scale mass demonstrations that included the broader non-Jewish public and linked the heroism of the ghetto fighters with the suffering of the Jewish martyrs, commemorations of the first anniversary in 1944 in the Yishuv were more muted in comparison, as the Yishuv in Palestine was more ambivalent on how to respond to the first anniversary of the revolt. What was the meaning of the uprising? Should it be celebrated as an example of Kiddush Hashem or collective martyrdom? Uncertainty over the details and identities of the heroes made it difficult to celebrate the revolt, even if, though on April 19, 1944, the first anniversary of the uprising, a day of outcry for the rescue of the Sherita Pleita was proclaimed throughout the Yishuv. As in New York, work ceased and fasting and public rallies took place. On April 21st, an article in Davar noted commemorations in the United States to mark the, quote, Day of the Warsaw Ghetto Heroes, citing proclamations by President Roosevelt that, quote, all people who support freedom in the world will forever remember the heroic war of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters. So how do we account for this discrepancy between commemorations in America and the Yishuv on the first anniversary of the revolt? In the United States, Jewish leaders could present the revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto as part of the Jewish contribution to the Allied war effort, as the outcry of the oppressed who refused to perish under the heel of fascism and would join the Allied cause to defeat Nazism. The Jewish Labor Committee celebrated the heroism of the workers who joined the Polish nation in the struggle against German oppression. Jewish religious leaders marked April 19th as a day of sorrow and mourning, where the heroism of the ghetto fighters would be remembered together with the suffering of the Jewish martyrs. The timing of the revolt was critical, as Jews eagerly sought hope amidst the despair, a light in the darkness, and heroes to whom they could connect. But who were the heroes? And more importantly for some, what was the political ideology that motivated their actions? It is clear that within a year of their uprising, the revolt had been transformed into the focal point of Jewish commemorations of the destruction of European Jewry, providing the ideal prism with which to remember the Jewish heroes and martyrs of Warsaw, and more broadly of European Jewry as a whole. While Jews in the free world desperately sought to imagine what it must have been like to participate in the glorious uprising, the lack of a clear picture did not prevent them from marking the date. As the heroes of the revolt were mythologized, the Bund and the Zionist movement continued to grapple over credit for the revolt. And while it was the name of Michal Klepfish that had become known as the most prominent leader of the revolt in the first year after the event, this would soon change, as new reports drafted by the underground in Warsaw reached London and the Yishuv. In response to reports that the Bund, the Jewish Labor Bund, was taking too much credit for leading the revolt, reports drafted by surviving members of the Jewish Fighting Organization living in hiding on the Aryan side of Warsaw would be sent in a parcel of documents on May 24th, 1944, adding further details on the history of the Jewish Fighting Organization, the course of fighting in the revolt, and the identities of the ghetto fighters, specifically naming Mordechai Anielewicz as commander of the revolt. A little over 1 year after the revolt had been finally crushed by Jürgen Stroop, the Jewish National Committee in Warsaw succeeded in delivering a trove of 120 pages on microfilm on May 24th, including a detailed history of the Jewish Fighting Organization, accounts of surviving ghetto fighters, and other documentation that would enable the Zionist movement to finally take credit for leading the revolt, detailing the role played by Zionist groups in the revolt, and the leadership of Mordechai Anielewicz as commander of the Jewish Fighting Organization. Over the course of several months, members of the Jewish National Committee worked to collect testimonies, write reports on the history of the Jewish Fighting Organization, and send letters to contacts in New York, London, and Tel Aviv. Although many messages written in Warsaw never made it to Jews in the free world, the surviving members of the underground were aware that the parcel of over 120 pages sent on May 24th, 1944, had special significance. And it was published later in that year. Excerpts were published, for example, in this book by Melech Neustadt on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Adolf Berman of the Jewish National Committee in Warsaw described the process of typing all 120 pages in a letter to David Guzik of the JDC, also in Warsaw. And here I'll just read to you an excerpt from this letter. Dear Mr. Jan, this was the code name for Guzik, this week we accomplished a great task, a large shipment to London. I worked on this day and night for a period of 10 days, May 15th to the 25th. This past week, I went to sleep every night at 4 a.m. I had to write, edit, and collect material at the greatest possible speed. But in the end, an impressive parcel was sent, a typed 10-page summary with 18 addenda attached, in total 120 typed pages. If this parcel arrive at London, this will have tremendous significance. I'm sending copies of the main joint letter to you via Mr. Yosef, along with a line about other documents. As you will see, we added your name among the signatures on the main letter and noted your work and that of the Joint Distribution Committee, also in the material. Nonetheless, it is clear that even before the identities of the heroes had been confirmed, as reports began to emerge from Warsaw, shared by the Jewish Workers Underground, and here you can see a book published by the Bund in New York, Ghetto in Flames, a collection of reports already published in 1944, and reports from the Jewish Fighting Organization and Jewish National Committee, identifying the leaders of the revolt and names of the fighters. Their identities were received, interpreted, and analyzed in a framework that was already quite contested and heavily weighted with meaning and significance, and that built on pre-existing political frameworks within which to incorporate such information. At the same time, the heroic saga of the revolt was mythologized in a manner that captured the attention of Jews around the world, allowing them to imagine what it might have been like to be there, engaged in the struggle against the Nazi oppressor. Surely the Jewish heroes of Warsaw were motivated by a desire to engage in self-defense, not to save lives, but to save their own dignity. But were they motivated by a Zionist connection to the land of Israel that inspired their revolt against diaspora oppression? Or did they rise up in defense of Poland and the ideals of democracy, the universal brotherhood of man, and the rights of the working class to resist totalitarianism? Or were the fighters united by a drive to take revenge and kill Nazis? Either way, it is clear that the revolt was too powerful a symbol to not be seized upon by Jews from across the ideological spectrum, well before the war was over. The timing of the uprising, coinciding with the transition to memorialization and mourning, also solidified the event as a date to remember both the heroes and martyrs of Warsaw and European Jewry more broadly. By the 5th anniversary of the revolt on April 19th, 1948, this had already become the clear date to commemorate Jewish suffering and heroism. On this date, Natan Rapoport's monument to the ghetto fighters was dedicated in Warsaw. As James Young has written, the monument itself was at once an edifice that, quote, literally supports the figures and meanings projected onto it, unquote. According to Young, Rapoport was adamant that the monument be placed on the site of the revolt, where Anielewicz had died in his bunker. As noted, the site had already been marked in April of 1946 with a stone marker. And I should note that Rapoport himself had been a member of the same Zionist youth movement as Anielewicz, Hashomer Hatzair. Rapoport and the committee agreed to place the monument on a spot nearby. Funding was provided primarily by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, with an understanding that the Central Committee of Polish Jews would eventually reimburse the joint. Additional donations were solicited by the Jewish community in Warsaw. After the war, the symbolic power of the revolt would be marshaled by the Zionist movement to support the struggle for the creation of the Jewish state after the Shoah. The Jewish heroes of Warsaw would be cast in stone as actors who burst forth from the ghetto to alter the course of history. On the back of the monument, the Jewish masses would recede back into the depths of the ghetto. Thank you. I'm very happy to take some of our Q&A questions.
Avi, thank you so much. That was outstanding. We have several questions. A bunch of them deal with the photo, the picture of the fighters, that there were no women. There seems to be a tremendous interest in the fact that women were heroes, and people want to know. There's one.
I'll go back to this picture. Yeah.
Seems like several people have said the same thing, that there was one woman in the picture.
So let me tell you what's going on here with this picture. I think, yes, and let me just get a pointer. Okay, so I think people are referring here.
Right.
So this is actually a little boy with payas, if you can see. And I think this is a really, really interesting point, and I'm glad that people have brought this forward, because some people may have noted that there's a new book that's just come out by Judy Battalion that looks at the role of heroic women in the resistance, the ghetto fighters, and other aspects of the resistance. And this is really important new research. And you know, in my book, I talk a lot about ghetto fighters like Tzivi Lebetkin and Tosia Altman, who play a really important role as underground couriers, sneaking between ghettos, smuggling information, smuggling weapons, smuggling documentation, anything they can between the ghettos. And this is on both the Zionist movement. Some people might be familiar with Vladka Mead. Fagala Pelto was her wartime name. Vladka Mead was her Vladka was her underground name. And there's a lot of interest in the period immediately after the war and the role that women played in the underground and in the fighting in the various ghettos. In fact, in 1946, the same week that Tzivi Lebetkin arrives in the Yishuv and delivers her testimony to leaders of the Zionist movement and to leaders of the socialist Zionist circles, and at Kibbutz Yagur on June 8th, 1946. That same week, Vladka Mead arrives in New York, and Vladka, who had been an active member of the Jewish Labor Bund and active in the underground and working as a courier, and then survived the revolt and helped organize rescue for Jews on the Aryan side of Warsaw, she arrives in New York the same week, and within a few days is interviewed by the Forverts. There's an article that's published in the Forverts just after her arrival, and it says Vladka a heroine of the Warsaw Ghetto. And then Vladka writes a series of articles. I write about this in the book. She writes a series of articles over the next 6 months that is called Vladka Delzelt. Vladka tells her story. And it's a remarkable, some of you might be familiar with it, subsequently translated with the help of her son, Stephen Mead, into English. It's a remarkable memoir. In English, it's called On Both Sides of the Ghetto Wall. And it's based on those accounts that were written in the forewords, although it's changed a little bit when it's published.
Thank you.
Stop the share for now.
All right, so here are some other. Oh, the first question that was asked was, can you explain who the Bundists were and what their ideals were?
Okay, good question. And I'm gonna group a couple of questions here together because I also see that there's a question about sort of the ideological identities of the different fighters from Paula Apsel. So the Bundists, the Jewish Labor Bund, was arguably the most important, or one of the most important Jewish political parties in interwar Poland. And essentially, the Jewish Labor Bund was a Jewish socialist movement that argued that the Zionists were misled in sort of their efforts to solve the problems of the Jewish people over there, meaning in the land of Israel, but that their work and their energies should be focused on solving the problems of the Jewish people here in Eastern Europe, where Jews had developed a unique culture and a civilization over the past 1,000 years or so. Jews should recognize that they are members of the working class, and the Bund was working hard to recognize the rights of the Jewish working class, but also to protect the rights of Jewish minorities to develop sort of a Jewish culture that was rooted in Yiddish language and culture and was very secular and sort of socialist ideals. So they are very much opposed to the Zionists in terms of interwar politics. There is no cooperation because they sort of do not agree at all politically, ideologically. They're antithetical to each other. The Bundists think that the Zionist sort of ideal to take Jews to Palestine, land of Israel, is completely mistaken. And so there's not a lot of trust between these groups. And so when the war breaks out in the ghetto, you have different political organizations representing sort of their pre-war political frameworks and pre-war youth movements, continuing on those same tracks. And there's not a lot of cooperation between the Bund and the Zionists and the ghetto. And this becomes sort of a point of debate and contention in the writing of the history of the organizing, the Jewish Fighting Organization, to the point that the question of whose idea was it first and who organized the first meeting of when should we form a Jewish Fighting Organization. And when Zuckerman says, I called for the first meeting before the Great Deportation, but the Bund wasn't really interested in it, right? There's sort of this squabbling that breaks out already in accounts that are written during the war. What's important, and I write about this in the book, is that they set aside all these differences, in particular after the Great Deportation, after most of Warsaw Jewry is deported to Treblinka, and this realization that they have to work together to form a united Jewish fighting organization when the next liquidation takes place. And most of the accounts that are written in the first year after the revolt talk about and emphasize the fact that they set aside those differences, and they, even though they have ideological differences, they are united in this struggle to fight and defend Jewish dignity, right? So there's an esprit de guerre, is what Leon Feiner calls it, the Bundist leader, that they're basically united behind this idea to defend Jewish dignity and take revenge on Nazis. And so that is something that unites all of them. What I focused on here is that it doesn't take long, though, after you have that sort of unity, and even among the surviving ghetto fighters. So the names that I listed there, the Jews, the ghetto fighters who escape from the ghetto through the sewers, are members of different parties. You have Ziv Lebetkin and Mark Edelman, who is part of the Bund, and they're crawling through the sewers together. And then after the revolt, when they go into hiding on the Aryan side of Warsaw, they're hiding together and they're helping each other survive. And yet they're drafting reports that emphasize different aspects of who took the leadership role in the fighting. So it's very interesting and to see how that develops.
Great. All right, let's see. Other questions. Here's anonymous. I wonder if you have found information about the Gizia concentration camp that was built after the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt on the grounds of the ruined Warsaw Ghetto to clean the bricks, looking for items of worth to be sent to Germany. My father, Isaac Senor, a Greek Jew from Salonika, was sent from Auschwitz to that camp with a few thousand other Jews to do that very hard work. His brother Saul's story is well known, as he tried to escape, was caught, and was hung in June 1944. If you have any information about the camp or anything about it, they would appreciate your sending
Sure.
information.
So I'll just say, yeah, this is an important aspect to what happens after the ghetto is destroyed. And there is essentially what is a concentration camp that's, as is alluded to, that's created within, you can visit it today, this Gensha part of the remains of the former ghetto. And because it's all rubble, it's all completely destroyed. It's burned to the ground, and Stroop destroys the whole ghetto. And the Nazis specifically bring in Greek Jews who will not know the local language and will not be able to connect with anybody else there to do this work, to do this hard labor. And a lot of the Jews who are rounded up and caught during the revolt, are subsequently deported from there to other camps like Majdanek, and to Auschwitz. I'll just mention one thing that's very interesting about this, and I didn't have time to talk about it in the talk today, is that I focused on the Jewish Fighting Organization and the 400 or 500 Jews who are members of the fighting organization. There are about 40,000 Jews who are still in the ghetto. And so the truth is that, and I have a colleague in Israel, Javi Dreyfus, who's just recently written a fascinating book on this topic that's called Ghetto Warszawa Sof, the End of the Warsaw Ghetto. And as Javi emphasizes, what makes the liquidation of the revolt and what makes the suppressing of the uprising so difficult for the Germans and why it takes so long is not just because of the armed conflict that they encounter, but it's the fact that most of the Jewish population in the ghetto goes into hiding underground. And Javi, argues, I think quite convincingly, that we also have to understand that that was a very important form of resistance, digging bunkers under the ghetto, resisting deportation, making it incredibly difficult, going house to house to try to root out ghettos. And sometimes we lose sight of that aspect of the resistance. Most people couldn't get weapons, couldn't get guns smuggled into the ghetto. So this was the way in which they resisted. I want to, if you don't mind, Debbie, I'll just, in the interest of time, I have the Q&A here, so I'll go down and try to answer this. So I see there's a question here from Phyllis about whether I think the Warsaw Ghetto became emblematic of other smaller uprisings that have not received requisite attention. Great question. You might have noticed, and I went through a lot of slides, but in one of the early reports of the Jewish Fighting Organization, Zuckerman writes that it's not just Warsaw, that there were revolts in Białystok, and there are revolts in Sobibor and revolts in Treblinka, and he was very careful to make sure to point out that this is the Hechalutz, the sort of the Zionist youth movements were very much involved in organizing resistance in lots of different places, not just in Warsaw. And yet, I think what Phyllis's question is pointing to is that, ironically, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because it's the most famous, because it becomes this focal point of commemorative activities, even though the ghetto fighters are trying to point out there's resistance happening in lots of other places and in smaller ghettos all over Eastern Europe, like a famous case of the revolt in Lachva, the Lachva ghetto, which is in present-day Belarus, almost unknown. But the Lachva Yisker book, the memorial book in Lachva, they call themselves Rishonim Lamered, the first to revolt, right? And So there's an ironic way in which this focus on Warsaw kind of overshadows all these other cases of resistance. Doron asks, can you talk about the role of the ZZW, this is the Jewish Military Union, and the leadership of Pavel Frankel? And this is a really important question, which there's been a lot of scholarship in recent years. And I think part of the issue, which I didn't have time to get into today, but one of the things that ends up happening is that with the focus on the socialist Zionist youth movements and sort of the debate between the Bund and the socialist Zionists in particular, the role of the revisionists gets overlooked and overshadowed. And in some of the early reports, you already hear addresses that sort of say, yes, the revisionist Zionists played an important role. And so I mentioned on the second day of the revolt, for example, this famous battle that takes place that's led by the Jewish Military Union, which is operating separately from the Jewish Fighting Organization. And so one of the things that ends up happening is that that memory gets forgotten for a long time. A lot of them die in that battle on the second day of the revolt. And so it doesn't become part of the historical narrative for years. And in recent years, there have been efforts of scholars who have tried to re-emphasize the role of the Jewish Military Union, of Pavel Frankel, of others who have their own sort of connections to the Polish army and then to the Polish underground, and are able to smuggle weapons into the northern part of the ghetto through a tunnel that is by Murnowska Square, and lead this very heavy battle on the second day of the revolt. But it doesn't get emphasized, especially by the labor Zionist establishment in the Yishuv, and certainly not by the Bundists in New York. So it's taken time until recent years. Moshe Ahrens has written a book called Flags Over the Ghetto, and other scholars have focused on, Lawrence Weinbaum and others have focused on this history. My colleague Fred Roden, hi Fred, says, can you tell us more about the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial in Riverside Park in New York City? So some of you may know that on the Upper West Side, there is this, what's called Der Stein, this stone on the Upper West Side, which was dedicated on October 19th, 1947. It was meant to be basically the American Jewish memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and to the destruction of European Jewry. And the stone is still there. And next week, whenever April 19th is, I guess in just about 2 weeks, there will be the annual commemoration that takes place there, always on April 19th, largely organized by the sort of Jewish Labor Committee Bundist circles, because that is the date. April 19th is the holy date, according to the Bund, the Heilige Dates, not sort of Yom HaShoah on the Jewish calendar. And it's still sort of the focal point, but there is no memorial that is built there. And that is something that I write about in the book, Fred, which goes into sort of the difficulties about, for years, there's back and forth about what should the design look like, what should the memorial look like. And then Rapoport's statue is built in New York, in Warsaw, and then the state of Israel is created, and maybe the memorial should be there and not in New York, and there's a debate about where to put the memorial. And then eventually all of those energies and efforts are channeled with a lot of help from Vladka and Benjamin Mead too, to the building of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in Battery Park. So some of those initial efforts never built on the Upper West Side, but that energy is eventually channeled into building that museum, which is in downtown New York. Marilyn. Hi, Marilyn. Okay, so Marilyn says, it seems that in the 21st century, the mandate to never forget focuses mostly on what happened in the concentration camps, not the ghettos. Auschwitz tattoo and the gas chambers remain the most potent symbols of death, even though more people died in the ghettos of starvation, disease, or of a single shot, and mass killings of ghetto residents. Why is the Warsaw Ghetto story being excluded from the popular narrative of the Shoah? Great question. And it was something that I was hinting at in the beginning of my talk, which is that why certain dates have different types of meaning. And I think it's a very interesting question for us to examine, sort of why does January 27th become International Holocaust Remembrance Day? I think we can understand why, right? It's the date of the liberation of Auschwitz. It's the date that the Red Army comes in and liberates the surviving Jews in Auschwitz and discovers the camp. But that has significance, right? It does project a certain type of interpretation as opposed to making the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising do that. Why is this? I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. I think that part of it has to do with sort of the narrative of the Jewish experience during the war, and which Jewish experience is privileged. So and I write about this in the book too, in the DP camps, it is the ghetto fighters, it is the partisans who are the unquestioned sort of top of, if we call it like a pyramid of memory, they're held up on the pedestal, right? And it becomes clear in the aftermath of the war, this is the Jewish experience of what happened during the war that from a Zionist perspective is going to be most useful and helpful to make our argument for like, this is why Jews should have their own state, Jews fought back. Let's sort of use this example to also channel our efforts in the creation of the state. Over time, and I think, Elie Wiesel is an important part of this process too, we see other aspects of Jewish experience being emphasized. So as the ghetto fighters sort of come down off that pedestal, and we have accounts like those of Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, for example, that rise in prominence to focus on the experience of suffering in Auschwitz, which then becomes a universal symbol of sort of not just Jewish suffering, but a universal symbol of suffering, that becomes the primary source of memory. I think some of it may also have to do, and it's going to change over time, and I'm very interested in how the memory changes over time. So today, most of the remaining Holocaust survivors who are still alive today were children during the war. And so I wouldn't be surprised is if we begin to see other stories that had not been the focal point, for example, the experiences of children who survive in hiding or sheltered or in other places, become a more important focal point. But I think it's interesting to see how that changes over time. How are we doing with time, Debbie?
Good.
Okay, so I'll keep going. Yeah, I have two more questions here. Let's see. So Anonymous writes in, I'm interested in how you outline the shaping of collective memory for political purposes. This still happens today by Jewish leaders. And my question is, do you have any thoughts on how new Holocaust research by academics might migrate over to more widespread Jewish consciousness and more nuanced understanding of the events of the Holocaust, and more importantly, the way we understand and frame these events until today and use them to inform our self-conception? I feel like academics complicate the picture of actual events and the aftermath, but widespread consciousness, the picture is not complicated, it is more black and white. I think that is very well put, that argument, and it's something that I've tried to sort of make this case, and something that I'm very interested in, which is what is the interplay between the history of an event and the memory of an event. And the interplay is this, that you can have in this case, surviving ghetto fighters who try to tell their story, but that information, that news is received and interpreted in a political environment, in a political framework. And it's immediately made use of. I mean, this is how collective memory is shaped for the needs of the day, for the sort of whatever political needs are used. I don't think it's cynical. I think this is actually sort of how sort of the interplay between history and memory works. I'll tell you one thing that I think is very interesting about this, because you talk about how Holocaust research by academics might migrate over to more widespread Jewish consciousness. So there is a tendency, and I co-edited another book that came out earlier this year that's called, or in 2020, that's called Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. And it's something that's published, it's co-edited with my colleague Laura Hilton. It's published by University of Wisconsin Press. And we try to sort of make a case of how we can take complicated academic research and make it usable by educators, and say that, I know there's a tendency to try to reduce teaching of the Holocaust to sort of powerful moral lessons, or say, what's the meaning of the Holocaust for today? Let's remember the Holocaust to fight anti-Semitism, right? These are things that we see sort of repeated all the time. And I think one of the things that we try to do is that our students are capable of understanding sort of the nuances of the complexity of history. And one of our responsibilities is to, when we teach them this history, is to focus on those nuances and those complexities. Have them wrestle with some of these difficult questions. Don't just reduce the history of the Holocaust to sort of overarching moral lessons, right? Spend the time. So you can't reduce it into a lesson that takes place over one day or one week, but spend the time focusing on one difficult question, one difficult topic, and get them to wrestle with it, to think about it. And I think this will be one of the ways in which we can take sort of this, what you call more academic thinking, and wrestle with some of the more complex questions that are often reduced into sort of overly simplistic educational or political messages.
One more question.
Sure. And I think I sort of answered the question about. I'll just say that this question about Beitar is linked to the previous question that Doron asked about the ZZW and the Jewish Military Union and Pavel Frankel. This is connected, right? Because the revisionist Zionists and their youth movement was Beitar, and it is very interesting to see, and this is something I look at in the book, that in those early reports, both of the Jewish National Committee that is looking at the Zionist groups and the Jewish Workers Underground that's focused on the Bundist groups, they both, at the time, and now I'm talking about 43, not long after the revolt, they are minimizing the role of Beitar. And it's not that, Pavel Frankel and the Jewish Military Union and members of Beitar were not fighting. I think one of the challenges is that a lot of them don't survive. And so, and there is pre-war political competition, and they weren't part of the Jewish fighting organization. So they were sort of fighting in their own military organization. And so they knew they were there. They knew that there were sort of allies fighting alongside them, but they weren't part of the same overarching structure that became the Jewish fighting organization. And I think this has a lot to do with sort of why, and again, for the politicization of history, why they're not inserted into the historical record for years afterwards.
Avi, thank you so much. So I hope everybody's enjoyed this program. I know I have. And that you want to buy Avi's book, which is in the chat, how you can get it. And you'll also get a letter tomorrow in case you can't find it in the link. And I also want to thank Linda and Jerry Spitzer for endowing this prize. I've been to all three. This was outstanding. I'm just sorry it wasn't at Sotheby's, because that's where we had it when we could meet in person. So I look forward to the day when we can be back in person. Our next webinar will take place on April 28th. Dora Paterchiza, I hope I pronounced her name right, will give a lecture on JDC's activity in Szeged, Hungary after the Holocaust. You can register for this via our JDC Archives Facebook page. And if you registered for this one, I'm sure you're going to get a link to do it. We hope that many of you will be able to join us then. Please sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for other programs. And also, again, a shout out to Jeff and Isabel and Linda Levy and everybody at JDC Archives. You're the best. They make me look so good as chairman of this committee. I just get to do some of the introductions. And Avi, it was just a pleasure to meet you today. And good luck on the book. I hope you sell it like crazy. And again, thank you all for coming today. It's been great. Bye.
Thank you, Debbie.